Katherine Monroe sat quietly in her office, fingers tapping rhythmically against her mahogany desk. The sprawling skyline of Indianapolis stretched before her, but her mind was elsewhere. The whispers had reached her weeks ago. Faint murmurs about discrimination at some of her Monroe Financial Group branches. Nothing concrete, nothing that screamed for media attention, but enough to gnaw at her conscience. She had built this bank with a singular vision: fairness, accessibility, and respect for every customer. It wasn't just about profits or market share. Monroe Financial Group was supposed to be different. But was it? That question haunted her. Despite the bank's clear policies on anti-discrimination and customer service excellence, Katherine knew words on a page could only go so far. Real change came from culture, and culture started with people. Were her employees truly treating everyone fairly, or was there a quiet bias lurking behind those polished counters? The doubt festered, growing louder with every passing day. Katherine had asked for internal reports, reviewed customer feedback, and even consulted her regional managers. Everything looked clean. Too clean. As if someone had carefully curated the numbers. So Katherine decided there was only one way to find out the truth. Today, she wasn't walking into one of her branches as Katherine Monroe, CEO of Monroe Financial Group. No designer suit, no silk blouse, no polished heels. Just a faded cardigan, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair, normally styled with precision, was pulled back in a loose ponytail. She wore no jewelry, except a simple wristwatch. The goal was simple: blend in. Be invisible. No special treatment, no assumptions. She chose a branch she knew well, one she had personally approved for expansion 3 years ago. She remembered standing outside that building, cutting the ceremonial ribbon, with a smile on her face. Back then, she had believed wholeheartedly that her values would carry down to the staff inside. Now, she wasn't so sure. Katherine pulled into the parking lot of the Monroe Financial branch in suburban Indianapolis. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the asphalt. The building's sleek glass windows gleamed in the light, and a faint scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air as she stepped inside. The lobby was quiet. A few customers waited in line, some scrolling their phones, others chatting softly. A man in a suit stood at the counter, greeted with a warm smile from the teller. An older woman in a floral dress sipped coffee while flipping through a brochure near the seating area. Everything seemed normal. But Katherine had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and approached the counter. The teller barely glanced up. A young woman in her mid-20s, pale complexion, dark hair pulled into a stiff ponytail. No smile. No greeting. Just a cold, disinterested once-over before her eyes flicked back to the computer screen. "Hi," Katherine said, her voice calm. "I'd like to make a withdrawal." The teller didn't bother to look up. She simply grabbed a clipboard from under the counter and shoved it forward. "Fill this out." Katherine's eyes narrowed slightly. No warmth. No standard greeting like she'd just witnessed moments ago. Just cold indifference. But she played along. Taking the clipboard, she filled out the form, $5,000. Not an extravagant amount, but enough to require ID verification. Katherine slid the completed form back to the teller and waited. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. The teller's eyes scanned the form, then flicked to Katherine's ID. Her expression tightened, barely perceptible. But there, Katherine felt the air in the room change. It wasn't about the money, it was about her. She knew what was coming next. The hesitation, the scrutiny, the assumption that she didn't belong, and she was ready for it. The teller's eyes lingered on Katherine's ID longer than necessary. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, then stopped. Something shifted in her expression, not concern, not confusion, but doubt. Suspicion. Katherine knew that look. She had seen it before, in business meetings where her ideas were questioned, in boardrooms where her presence was underestimated. But here, in her own bank, it felt personal. The teller finally looked up, her gaze colder than before. I'll be right back," the teller muttered, grabbing Katherine's ID and disappearing through a door marked manager's office. She didn't explain why. No assurance like, "I just need to verify a few details." No polite smile. Just an awkward retreat. As if Katherine's presence had suddenly become a problem. Katherine exhaled slowly, tapping her nails against the marble countertop. She could feel the tension rising in the room, like an unspoken shift that everyone seemed to notice but no one acknowledged. 5 minutes passed. Then 6. A man in a wrinkled business suit stepped up to the counter next to Katherine. The same teller had greeted him earlier, smiling, friendly, no hesitation. Now, as another teller helped him, the transaction moved swiftly. No questions, no manager involved. Just smooth, effortless service. Katherine clenched her jaw. Across the lobby, a woman in a floral dress was chatting easily with another teller. The conversation was casual, punctuated with light laughter. No signs of tension. No cold stares. It wasn't just Katherine's imagination. Something was different. She shifted her gaze back toward the frosted glass door where the teller had disappeared. It remained closed. Another minute passed. The faint hum of whispered conversations filled the air. A few customers stole glances in Katherine's direction. They weren't obvious, but she felt their eyes, flickering her way, quickly turning back as if they didn't want to be caught staring. 7 minutes now. Katherine inhaled deeply and glanced at her watch. Patience was wearing thin, and her frustration simmered just beneath the surface. Finally, the door creaked open. The teller reappeared, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a stocky man in his 50s with rimless glasses perched on his nose and a tightly buttoned suit straining against his broad shoulders. His name tag read, Franklin Reed, branch manager. Katherine immediately recognized the look on his face, polite on the surface, but calculated underneath. He wasn't approaching her with the relaxed confidence of someone genuinely trying to help. He was assessing her, like someone approaching a problem they weren't sure how to handle. "Afternoon, ma'am," Franklin said with a forced smile. "I understand you're trying to make a withdrawal?" Katherine met his gaze evenly. "That's right," she said firmly. $5,000. From my account. With my ID. Her words were measured, calm, but unmistakably sharp. Franklin's smile didn't budge, but his eyes flicked to the teller, who stood slightly behind him, her posture stiff. "Mind if I take another look at your identification?" Franklin asked, extending his hand. Katherine's patience thinned. "I already gave it to her," she said, tilting her head toward the teller. "I understand," Franklin said smoothly, still holding out his hand. "Just want to make sure everything checks out." Reluctantly, Katherine handed her ID to him. Franklin held it up to the light, squinting at it like it was some rare artifact under inspection. He flipped it over, scanned the back, then returned his focus to Katherine. "Miss Monroe," he began, voice overly polite, "is this your first time banking with us?" Katherine blinked, stunned by the audacity of the question. "I've banked here since this branch opened," she said flatly. "I was here the day you cut the ribbon." Her gaze hardened. "In fact, I'm the one who approved the budget that paid for that ribbon." Franklin's smile twitched, but he kept his voice neutral. "And you said you're withdrawing $5,000? "That's what I wrote down," Katherine said, her tone sharpening. The energy in the room shifted. Customers nearby were now stealing longer glances. The subtle hum of conversation had faded. Franklin turned the ID over in his fingers once more, then, without even looking at her, asked, "And what do you do for work, Miss Monroe?" Katherine let out a short, disbelieving laugh, more out of irritation than humor. "I'm in finance," she answered coolly. "Oh?" Franklin's eyebrows lifted. "What kind?" Katherine let the silence stretch just a little longer than necessary, before replying. "Banking." For a brief second, Franklin's smile faltered. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "I see," he said slowly. "And this is a personal account, correct? Not a business one?" "That's what it says on the form," Katherine said tightly. Another slow nod. Another flick of his eyes to the teller. More hesitation. Then, as if reaching some silent conclusion, Franklin placed her ID on the counter and pressed it firmly beneath his palm. "Unfortunately," he said with a forced sigh, "we won't be able to process this withdrawal at this time." Katherine's pulse spiked. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low. Franklin clasped his hands in front of him, adopting an expression of carefully measured concern. "We're unable to verify the transaction," he said evenly. Katherine's fingers curled against the marble countertop. "What do you mean?" she demanded. "You have my ID. You have my account number. What's there to verify?" "It's just a precaution," Franklin said, his tone sliding into condescension. "We take security very seriously." Security. The word landed with a weight that made Katherine's stomach tighten. This wasn't about fraud. This wasn't about protocol. This was about her, what she looked like, how she was dressed, and what Franklin assumed that meant. But if Franklin thought she was about to back down, he was gravely mistaken. Katherine leaned in slightly, her voice low and firm. "Tell me, Franklin," she said coolly, "if I were a man in a suit, standing here with a Rolex on my wrist, would you be asking me these questions?" For the first time, Franklin's smug expression faltered, just for a second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face before he quickly masked it. "This isn't about appearance," he said stiffly. "It's about policy." Katherine's lips curled into a humorless smile. "Is that right?" The air in the room thickened, tension filling the space between them. Franklin's fingers drummed once against her ID. And then, in a move Katherine hadn't anticipated, one that shifted the situation from frustrating to infuriating, Franklin reached under the counter and pressed a small button near the register. He had just called security. Katherine Monroe's eyes locked on Franklin's hand as it withdrew from beneath the counter. The barely audible click of the silent alarm wasn't lost on her. He had just called security, over her. For a brief second, Katherine almost laughed. The sheer absurdity of it. A bank manager escalating a simple withdrawal into a full-blown confrontation was almost too much to believe. But this wasn't funny, it was calculated, deliberate. And Katherine wasn't about to let it slide. "You called security?" Her voice was low and even, but there was a sharpness to it now. Franklin's forced smile widened. "Too tight, too rehearsed." "Just a precaution, ma'am. We want to ensure all our customers have a smooth experience." Katherine's fingers curled against the countertop. "A smooth experience," she repeated, her voice icy. "I watched you process that man's transaction 10 minutes ago. No questions. No manager intervention. No security. But now, suddenly, my transaction is a security concern?" Franklin's smile wavered for a second. "I'm sorry if you feel that way," he said in that same insincere tone, "but our policies are in place for a reason." "Right," Katherine shot back. "And those policies only seem to apply to certain people, don't they?" Franklin's expression hardened, his polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the irritation beneath. "Miss Monroe," he said, his tone firmer now, "if you'd just return with additional documentation, we'd be happy to assist you." "Documentation?" Katherine repeated, incredulous. "I've given you my ID, my account number, and I've been banking here longer than you've worked here." She took a slow step forward, lowering her voice. "I know exactly what this is, Franklin. And I'm not leaving until I get my money." "Ma'am," Franklin said stiffly, straightening his posture. "If you continue to raise your voice—" "I'm not raising my voice," Katherine cut in. "But if you keep talking to me like I'm some kind of criminal, I just might." Before Franklin could respond, the security guard appeared. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to diffusing tension with intimidation alone. His hand hovered uncomfortably close to his belt, a stance that wasn't exactly hostile, but suggested he was ready to escalate if needed. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his voice calm but firm. "That depends," Katherine said coolly, turning to face him. "Are you here to help me access my money, or are you here to escort me out?" The guard hesitated, glancing between Katherine and Franklin. Franklin jumped in before the guard could answer. "Miss Monroe is unable to provide adequate verification for her withdrawal," he said smoothly, flashing the guard a thin smile. "I was simply explaining that we need more documentation." "That's not what happened," Katherine cut in sharply. "He's refusing to process my withdrawal, despite having my ID, my account number, and full access to my transaction history. And now he's wasting my time by bringing you over here like I'm causing a scene." The guard shifted uneasily, clearly unsure who to believe. Franklin, sensing this, leaned closer to him. "It's just a precaution," Franklin repeated, voice low. "I think it's best if she comes back another time." Katherine felt her pulse spike. He was trying to manipulate the guard, trying to spin this into a situation where she looked unreasonable. "Don't do this, Franklin," Katherine warned. "You're making a mistake." Franklin's smug smile widened. "I'm just following protocol, ma'am." There it was. Protocol. The perfect excuse for people like Franklin to hide behind their own bias. Katherine reached into her bag, and Franklin's smile faltered. The security guard's hand instinctively shifted closer to his belt. Relax, Katherine said sharply, holding up her phone. I'm just making sure I get this on record. You can't record in here, Franklin barked. Oh yes, I can, Katherine countered. She tapped the screen, activating the camera. This is a public place, and I'm documenting how your branch treats certain customers. The room shifted. Customers who had previously pretended not to notice were now watching openly. A man near the waiting area crossed his arms. The elderly woman in the floral dress had stopped flipping through her brochure and was staring directly at Franklin. Franklin's confidence began to crack. Miss Monroe, he said slowly, if you'd just, you know what's funny? Katherine interrupted. If I were a man in a tailored suit, holding a leather briefcase, I wouldn't be standing here right now. If I looked like you expected a customer with money to look, you'd have handed me my cash and wished me a good day. The tension in the room became suffocating. Franklin's face darkened. You've made your point, he said tightly. Now I'm going to ask you to leave. No, Katherine said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. Franklin's smile disappeared altogether. Then I'm afraid I'll have to ask Marcus here to escort you out. Katherine didn't blink. Go ahead, she said, voice cold as steel. But when I leave, this footage goes straight to my legal team, and by this time tomorrow, your name will be all over corporate headquarters. For the first time, Franklin looked genuinely unsettled. His bravado wavered, his gaze flicking to the security guard for support. But the guard, now clearly uncomfortable, seemed hesitant to intervene. Franklin, Katherine said, voice low enough that only he could hear, you need to think very carefully about your next move. Franklin swallowed hard. His fingers, still resting on her ID, twitched slightly. This isn't over, he muttered, but there was no confidence left in his voice. You're right, Katherine shot back, taking a deliberate step back. It's not. She locked eyes with the security guard. You should stay right where you are, she said quietly. Because I have a feeling you're about to witness something you'll want to remember. With that, Katherine tucked her phone back into her bag and folded her arms across her chest. She wasn't leaving. And Franklin knew it. The security guard shifted uncomfortably, his hand still hovering near his belt. His name tag read Marcus Holt, and his posture spoke of years of training, calm, controlled, yet prepared to react in an instant. Ma'am, Marcus said evenly, his voice measured. I'm going to have to ask you to step outside. Katherine Monroe turned slowly to face him, her expression calm but unyielding. No, she said firmly. I'm not going anywhere. The room seemed to tighten around her. Customers had stopped pretending not to notice. Some whispered quietly to each other, while others simply watched. Sensing that this was no longer a simple dispute, it was something far more serious. Franklin Reed stepped forward again, clearly emboldened by Marcus's presence. His fake smile returned, smug, calculated. You heard him, Franklin said, voice rising with false authority. This doesn't need to get any more difficult than it already is. Oh, this isn't difficult, Katherine shot back. You're the one making it difficult. Franklin's face twitched at her defiance. Miss Monroe, he said tightly, I'm asking you one last time, either you leave now, or Marcus will escort you out. Katherine folded her arms. I'm not leaving without my money. Marcus cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the standoff. "Ma'am," he said slowly. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job," Katherine cut in, "is to ensure this bank's security, not to intimidate paying customers." Marcus hesitated. He glanced at Franklin, who was now glaring at him, clearly demanding action. "I need you to cooperate," Marcus said, though his tone wasn't quite as firm this time. Katherine could see the doubt flickering in Marcus's eyes, the hesitation of a man who wasn't entirely convinced he was on the right side of this. "Cooperate?" Katherine repeated. "I've done everything I was supposed to. I provided my ID, my account number, and my withdrawal request. I followed every rule. And yet, here I am, being treated like a threat." Franklin stepped forward again, trying to regain control. "Ma'am," he barked, "this is your final warning." "Or what?" Katherine shot back. "What exactly are you planning to do, Franklin? Drag me out of my own bank for asking to access my own money?" Franklin's smug smile faltered. This isn't your bank, he snapped. Catherine's eyes narrowed. Isn't it? Her voice was razor sharp now. You're being difficult, Franklin said through clenched teeth. No, Katherine countered, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room. I'm being persistent. Because I know exactly what this is. This isn't about security. This isn't about policy. This is about you, deciding I don't belong here. The words hit their mark. Franklin's face flushed red. That's enough, he barked, motioning sharply to Marcus. Escort her out, now. Marcus hesitated again. Sir, he said slowly, maybe we should just, now. Franklin snapped. Marcus let out a slow breath, clearly reluctant. "Ma'am," he said softly, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. Catherine's gaze never left Franklin's. I'm not the one making this hard, she said coldly. Then she turned to Marcus. But if you really think I'm the problem here, then go ahead. Lay a hand on me. But just know. Her voice lowered to a dangerous calm. The second you do, this recording goes viral, and by tomorrow morning, everyone in this city will know exactly what happened inside this branch. She tapped her phone screen, and the red recording light glowed brighter. You're recording? Franklin's voice faltered. Oh yes, Katherine said coolly. Since the moment you decided I wasn't welcome here. The tension in the room was suffocating now. You think that's going to scare me? Franklin sneered. Go ahead, post your little video. It won't change a thing. Katherine's smile was thin, humorless. Won't it? Franklin's confidence wavered. You don't get it, do you? Katherine said, her voice sharpening. This isn't just about me. If this is how you treat me, imagine how you've treated people who couldn't push back. People who don't have a platform or the resources to fight back. People you thought you could dismiss without consequence. Franklin's face paled. I've seen managers like you before, Katherine continued. The kind who think their little branch is their personal kingdom. The kind who think they get to decide who's worthy of service and who isn't. Franklin's fingers twitched at his sides. You need to leave, he said again, but the authority was draining from his voice. I'm not leaving, Katherine said flatly. Not without my money. Not without accountability. Marcus, still standing uncertainly between them, finally turned to Franklin. Sir, he said carefully, maybe we should just call corporate. Corporate? Franklin barked. I am corporate. No, Franklin, Katherine said, her voice low and steady. I am corporate. Franklin's face twisted in confusion. What the hell are you talking about? Katherine reached into her bag and calmly retrieved her ID. But this time, she didn't hold it up for Franklin to inspect. She tapped her finger against the name printed on it. Katherine Monroe, she said clearly. Founder and CEO of Monroe Financial Group. The color drained from Franklin's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Yeah, Katherine said quietly. That's what I thought. Marcus shifted awkwardly, clearly unsure what to do next. You called security, Katherine said, turning her attention back to Marcus. Now that you know who I am, I suggest you call someone else, someone who actually knows what they're doing. Marcus's expression flickered with a mix of regret and discomfort. He reached for his radio. Yeah, he muttered. I think we're gonna need to contact regional management. You do that, Katherine said sharply. And while you're at it. She turned back to Franklin. You might want to start packing your things. Franklin's face was a mask of disbelief, but beneath it, Katherine could see the panic setting in. Because now, the one person Franklin had tried to dismiss, the one he had underestimated from the start, was the one holding all the cards. And he knew it. For a long moment, the entire bank lobby seemed frozen in place. Franklin Reed stood rigid, his face drained of color. The smooth-talking branch manager, who moments earlier had been so smug and self-assured, now looked like a man who had just realized he was teetering on the edge of a very steep cliff. You're lying, Franklin said, but the words lacked conviction. His voice was brittle, hollow, a last-ditch attempt to deny what was now painfully obvious. Katherine Monroe didn't blink. Instead, she calmly lifted her ID once more, this time tapping her manicured nail against her name. Katherine Monroe. Bold, unmistakable. I built this bank, she said quietly, her voice carrying enough weight to make Franklin's shoulders slump ever so slightly. From the ground up. Every branch, every policy, every piece of training material, I signed off on it." She let the words hang in the air, watching Franklin squirm beneath their weight. "I approved the funding for this very branch," Katherine continued, her voice sharpening. "I stood outside those glass doors on opening day and shook your hand when you were hired." Her gaze hardened. "And you don't even remember me?" Franklin's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You don't remember me," Katherine repeated, her voice cold. "Because you never bothered to look past your own assumptions." The silence in the room had grown unbearable now. Even the customers, who had initially been hesitant to involve themselves, were fully engaged. The older woman in the floral dress looked from Katherine to Franklin, her expression tight with disapproval. A man in a suit near the back stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head. Katherine's gaze flicked to the security guard, Marcus, who still lingered awkwardly by the counter. "You," she said, her voice softer now. "I want you to think very carefully about the role you played here today." Marcus stiffened, his hand slowly dropping away from his belt. "Ma'am, I am. You didn't ask questions," Katherine cut him off. "You didn't assess the situation. You just reacted." She paused. "But you're not the only one. This," she gestured to Franklin, "started because one person looked at me and assumed I didn't belong. I was just following protocol." Franklin muttered, but even he knew how weak those words sounded now. "Protocol?" Katherine repeated, incredulous. "No, Franklin. Protocol is checking ID when someone asks to make a withdrawal. Protocol is confirming account details before handing over cash. What you did wasn't protocol, it was profiling." The words hit like a hammer. Franklin flinched. "You decided that because I walked in here in sneakers and a cardigan, instead of heels and a designer suit, that I wasn't legitimate." Katherine's voice rose slightly, just enough to press the point home. "And when I didn't look the way you expected a CEO to look, you decided to turn me into a threat." Franklin's eyes darted desperately toward Marcus, but the security guard's gaze had fallen to the floor. He wasn't about to back Franklin now. "Miss Monroe," Franklin started, his voice now shaky, "I truly apologize if there was a misunderstanding." Katherine let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "A misunderstanding?" She shook her head. "No, Franklin. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. You didn't want me here, so you threw every roadblock in my path until you thought you could force me out." Franklin opened his mouth again, but Katherine held up a hand. "No. You've said enough." She reached into her bag once more, pulling out a business card. Her fingers tapped it twice against the marble countertop, before sliding it across to Franklin. "That," she said, "is my direct line." She leaned in slightly, her voice quiet but powerful. "And you're going to call it first thing tomorrow morning. You're going to schedule a meeting with Monroe Financial Group's corporate office, where you'll explain, in excruciating detail, why you decided that following protocol meant humiliating your own CEO in front of a room full of customers." Franklin's fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the card. "Miss Monroe," he stammered, "I can process your withdrawal right now." Katherine tilted her head, her expression hard. "Do you honestly think this is about $5,000? She asked, voice sharp. "Do you really believe that giving me my money now is going to erase everything you just did?" Franklin's face was practically gray now. "I swear, I didn't mean, you meant every second of it," Katherine cut in. "Because if I hadn't said a word, if I hadn't pulled out my phone, you would have felt perfectly justified in kicking me out of my own bank." She stepped back, slipping her ID into her wallet. "Well, congratulations, Franklin. You didn't just make a bad call today, you made the kind of mistake that's going to follow you for the rest of your career." She turned away from him, now addressing the entire room, the customers, the staff, everyone who had witnessed what had unfolded. "I built Monroe Financial Group on the promise that everyone, no matter how they look, no matter what they wear, no matter where they come from, deserves to be treated with respect," she said firmly. "Today, I saw what happens when that promise is broken. And I promise you, this will never happen again." She paused for a heartbeat, letting her words settle. Then she turned back to Franklin. "You might want to start packing your things," she said flatly. "Because tomorrow, you're done." Franklin's face twisted in panic. "Please, Miss Monroe." But Katherine didn't stop. She turned on her heel and walked calmly toward the glass doors. The tension that had once suffocated the room seemed to lift with her steps. "Ma'am." Marcus called out awkwardly as she reached the exit. Katherine paused, glancing back. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I should have handled that better. For the first time, Katherine's expression softened. Learn from it, she said simply. Don't let someone like him pull you into their mess again. With that, Katherine stepped outside, breathing in the cool afternoon air. She had come here for answers, and now she had them. But this wasn't over yet. Franklin wasn't just one bad employee, he was a symptom of a deeper problem, one she now knew she couldn't ignore. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. And Katherine Monroe was more than ready for it. The morning after her confrontation at the branch, Katherine Monroe sat at the head of a long mahogany conference table inside Monroe Financial Group's corporate headquarters. Sunlight streamed through the glass windows. But there was no warmth in the air, only tension. The room was filled with her executive team, regional managers, compliance officers, and public relations specialists. Each of them sat stiffly, eyes shifting uneasily between one another. At the far end of the table, Franklin Reed sat slouched in his chair, his face pale and drawn. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a defeated silence. Before we begin, Katherine said, her voice calm but firm, let me make one thing clear. What happened yesterday wasn't just a failure in customer service. It was a failure of leadership, accountability, and trust. Her gaze settled on Franklin. And that kind of failure comes with consequences. Franklin swallowed hard. His fingers fidgeted nervously with the lapel of his blazer. I spoke with several customers from the branch last night, Katherine continued. Apparently, what I experienced wasn't an isolated incident. There have been multiple complaints about discrimination and biased treatment over the past year, all tied directly to your branch. Her voice dropped lower. And every one of those complaints was swept under the rug. Franklin opened his mouth to defend himself, but Katherine wasn't finished. You abused your position, she said coldly. You targeted customers based on assumptions, and you manipulated your staff into following your lead. She leaned forward, her hands folding neatly on the table. That branch was supposed to represent everything. Monroe Financial Group stands for fairness, respect, and trust. Instead, you turned it into your own personal kingdom. Franklin's face reddened. I was just what? Katherine cut him off. Following protocol? Hiding behind policies you bent to suit your bias? She shook her head. Don't insult my intelligence, Franklin. We both know what happened yesterday had nothing to do with security, and everything to do with your assumptions about who does, and doesn't, belong in a bank like ours. The room remained silent. No one was willing to speak up for Franklin now. I reviewed the footage, Katherine added. Not just from yesterday, but from the past 6 months. Do you know what I saw? She didn't wait for his answer. Time and time again, you questioned customers who didn't fit your narrow idea of what wealth looks like. Working class families. Immigrants. People you assumed couldn't possibly have money. She sat back in her chair, her eyes sharp as glass. Those days are over. Franklin's gaze darted toward one of the HR officers, as if silently pleading for someone to intervene. Your employment is terminated, Katherine said firmly, effective immediately. Franklin's mouth hung open, stunned. You can't. Oh, I can, Katherine interrupted. And I did. She turned to one of her senior managers. Security will escort Mr. Reed out when this meeting concludes. His credentials are already deactivated. She turned back to Franklin. By the time you get back to that branch, they'll already have your replacement. Franklin's face twisted with anger, but he knew there was no point in arguing. You know, Katherine added coolly, if you'd just processed my withdrawal, if you'd treated me like any other customer, you'd still have a job right now. She let those words hang in the air like a final nail in the coffin. Now, Katherine said, turning her attention back to the rest of the room. Let's talk about what happens next. Rebuilding trust for the next hour, Katherine led her team through a series of aggressive policy changes. Every branch manager across the state would be required to attend mandatory bias training, effective immediately. All staff members, from tellers to leadership, would undergo intensive retraining to reinforce Monroe Financial's core values, respect, equality, and customer-first service. But Katherine didn't stop there. She implemented a new accountability hotline, a direct line where customers could report discrimination, misconduct, or any instance where they felt mistreated. Every report would go directly to corporate. No more hiding behind branch managers like Franklin Reed. She also launched a mystery customer program, where undercover evaluators would visit branches, posing as customers from diverse backgrounds, ensuring no one could get away with treating people unfairly again. Finally, Katherine announced a customer advisory board, made up of real Monroe Financial clients, working families, retirees, and small business owners, to ensure the bank's leadership never lost touch with the people they were supposed to serve. "I refuse to let what happened yesterday define this company," Katherine said firmly as the meeting concluded. "But change doesn't happen because of words on a page. It happens because we refuse to accept the way things are." She paused, scanning the faces in the room. "And starting today, I refuse to accept anything less than the respect our customers deserve." The aftermath. News of Franklin's firing, and the new policies Katherine had rolled out, spread quickly. Local media picked up the story, praising Monroe Financial for taking swift action. Katherine knew the public didn't care that she was CEO. They cared that she was willing to stand up, speak out, and demand change. The footage from her confrontation at the branch, the moment when Franklin arrogantly dismissed her, the way he reached for security as if she were a threat, made its way online. The video went viral overnight, with thousands of comments applauding Katherine's composure and courage. "That's how you lead." She didn't just talk about change, she made it happen. "I'd trust my money in her bank any day." The praise was overwhelming, but for Katherine, this was never about publicity, it was about something far more important: accountability. One last visit a week later, Katherine returned to the Indianapolis branch. This time, she wasn't in sneakers and a cardigan. She wore a sharp navy blue blazer, tailored slacks, and low heels, not to intimidate, but to ensure her presence commanded respect. The new branch manager, Linda Moore, greeted her personally. "I heard what happened," Linda said softly, as they stood in the middle of the lobby. "I want you to know, we won't let it happen again." "I know you won't," Katherine replied. As she turned to leave, a customer, a man in his 60s, dressed in faded work clothes, caught her attention. "Miss Monroe?" he called. She paused, smiling warmly. "Yes? I just wanted to say thank you," the man said. "For standing up. For people like me." Katherine's smile widened. "You shouldn't have to thank me," she said. "That's what you deserve." And with that, she walked back through the glass doors, her heels clicking sharply against the polished tile. The bank, her bank, was finally on the right path. 3 months had passed since Katherine Monroe's confrontation at the Indianapolis branch. A confrontation that had started with quiet assumptions and ended with an entire company facing its uncomfortable truths. The aftermath had been swift, but the real work, the part that mattered most, was just beginning. Katherine had made it clear: Monroe Financial Group would no longer tolerate bias, discrimination, or complacency. But words alone couldn't fix what had happened. Real change required action. A new culture takes root from day one. The new policies Katherine had implemented began to reshape the company's culture. The accountability hotline quickly proved its worth. Calls poured in, not because the bank's branches were filled with problems, but because customers now felt safe speaking up. Minor complaints were addressed promptly, while more serious concerns were escalated directly to corporate. No branch manager could bury a report again. The mystery customer program became a game changer. Evaluators visited branches unannounced, posing as customers from diverse backgrounds. Some came dressed in business attire, others in worn jeans and old sneakers. The results were revealing. Most employees passed the test, providing warm, professional service regardless of appearance. But a few? A few had shown the same toxic behavior Franklin Reed once displayed. Those employees were swiftly dismissed. The Customer Advisory Board became the heart of Monroe Financial's rebuilding process. At the quarterly meetings, real clients voiced concerns directly to senior leadership. They didn't sugarcoat their experiences, they told the truth, and Katherine welcomed it. Customers felt heard. They felt valued. And more importantly, they felt like they belonged. For Katherine, these weren't just policy updates, they were a message. No customer would ever leave one of her banks feeling small, dismissed, or unwelcome again. Facing the past, but change didn't come without resistance. Some employees quietly grumbled about the new training programs, convinced that the new policies were overly strict or unnecessary. Katherine knew better. It was necessary. Not just for the company, but for every customer who had ever walked out of her branches feeling judged or disrespected. She refused to back down. "You don't like the new policies?" she had said at an internal meeting. "Then you're free to leave. But if you stay, you'll treat everyone with respect. Or I'll walk you out the door myself." Her message was clear. The old ways were gone, and they weren't coming back. A letter that changed everything one morning. While sorting through her mail, Katherine came across a handwritten letter. The envelope was wrinkled, the handwriting shaky. Curious, she opened it. "Dear Miss Monroe, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I wanted to say thank you. My wife and I came into your bank a few months ago, and we had an experience a lot like what you went through. The manager, Franklin, I think his name was, treated us like we didn't belong there. My wife cried all the way home. We never reported it. Figured no one would believe us anyway. But then we saw you on the news. We saw you stand up for yourself, and for people like us. And it meant something. It showed us that someone actually cared, someone with the power to fix it. So, thank you. For fighting for folks like us. Sincerely, James and Maria Wilkins." Katherine sat quietly for a long time after reading the letter. The memory of that day, Franklin's smug smile, the way Marcus had hovered at her side like she was a threat, came rushing back. But now, that anger was replaced with something else. Purpose. This was why she had fought so hard. Not for headlines. Not for personal pride. But for people like James and Maria, people who had been overlooked, ignored, or mistreated because someone decided they didn't fit the mold. And now, that mold had been broken. A new beginning. One afternoon, Katherine decided to return to the Indianapolis branch, the place where this all began. This time, she didn't come in quietly. She walked through the glass doors wearing a crisp navy blazer, her head high, her presence commanding. The new manager, Linda Moore, greeted her with a smile, a warm, genuine one. "Miss Monroe," Linda said, her voice steady. "It's good to see you again." Katherine smiled back. "It's good to be here." The lobby felt different now, more welcoming. Tellers greeted customers with warmth, chatting openly with the people they served. A young man in construction boots and a faded flannel shirt was depositing a stack of cash, and no one gave him a second glance. An older woman in a floral dress was at the counter, laughing with a teller who seemed genuinely engaged in conversation. This was what a bank was supposed to feel like: safe, familiar, comfortable. A place where everyone knew they belonged. Katherine turned back to Linda. "You've done good work here," she said. "We're just getting started," Linda replied. Katherine grinned. "Good. Because so am I." A lasting legacy in the months that followed. Monroe Financial Group's reputation didn't just recover, it thrived. Customers flocked to the bank, many openly praising Katherine's leadership and her refusal to back down. Employees took pride in their new culture, one where fairness wasn't just a slogan, but a commitment they lived by every day. As Katherine stood in her office one evening, gazing out at the skyline, she allowed herself a rare moment of reflection. The journey hadn't been easy, confronting Franklin, challenging her own employees, and forcing the company to face its flaws, but it had been worth it. Because now Monroe Financial Group wasn't just her bank. It was a place where everyone belonged. And as long as Katherine Monroe was in charge, that was never going to change. The story of Katherine Monroe carries a powerful lesson. Change doesn't happen by staying silent. It happens when we refuse to accept injustice. Katherine could have walked away when she was mistreated, but instead, she stood her ground. She knew that allowing unfair treatment to go unchallenged would only allow it to continue, not just for herself, but for others who lack the voice or power to push back. Her courage reminds us that confronting discrimination, bias, or poor treatment is not just about defending ourselves. It's about protecting those who may not have the strength to fight on their own. Whether in a bank, a workplace, or within our own communities, standing up for what's right is how lasting change begins. For older generations, this lesson is especially meaningful. Many have faced similar moments in their lives, times when they felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed. Katherine's story is proof that our voices matter, no matter our age or background. When we speak up with courage and conviction, We don't just change one moment. We create a ripple effect that can change the world around us. Katherine Monroe's story is a reminder that true leadership means standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can continue sharing powerful stories of courage, resilience, and the strength to create lasting change.